It's my pleasure now to introduce the Honourable Chris Bowen, MP, the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship. I'm sure you all know who he is, and we've been waiting with great anticipation for you to arrive. Minister, I think it's a pity in a lot of ways you haven't been able to be with us all week, because we've had a fantastic 4 days, and I think what's been special about this conference is the mix of people who've come to Australia from a refugee background, service providers from Australia, service providers from across the Asia-Pacific region, people from representing UNHCR in Geneva and locally. So we've had an amazing mix of different people discussing, I think, every single aspect of refugee life, from the moment of persecution, flight, hearing stories of the horrendous experiences people go through on the way to Australia, and then what happens during resettlement. We've heard some incredibly positive and moving stories, and it's the sort of thing that we would like to share with more people than we've been able to. So that's what we've been doing all week. We've been waiting to speak to you. We had the pleasure of hearing Kate Lundy talk to us on Tuesday, and now with that I'm just going to hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I know this is an important conference, and I have had feedback about the... We'll just let the guests have their say. Well, thanks, ladies and gentlemen. I was just about to say that it's an understatement to say that refugee policy in this country ignites a lot of passion. And I don't think Australia is alone in that regard. Invariably, Australians hold a strong view about these issues. And I don't hesitate to say for 1 second that Australia's had a positive experience in the resettlement of refugees over a long period of time. I'm proud of the fact that we've been able to provide refuge to 750,000 people since World War II. But we, unquestionably in my view, have benefited from the social, economic and cultural contribution of those refugees over many decades. And today I'm delighted to launch a new report which underlines that conclusion. Professor Graham Hugo has completed an in-depth report on the contribution of refugees in our society. Australia's humanitarian program is something all Australians can and should be proud of. Since 1945, more than 750,000 people have found refuge from harm and a new life in Australia. As a lifetime resident of Fairfield in Western Sydney, where so many refugees have settled, I've seen firsthand the challenges that many refugees have had to overcome, and also the benefits that they individually and collectively have brought to Australia. Anecdotally, we've known for a long time that refugees and their children have usually turned out to be highly successful members of our society, but we haven't always been able to substantiate this with concrete research. Now I'm very pleased to say we have that research. My department commissioned Professor Graham Hugo from the University of Adelaide to undertake a detailed study of the economic, social and civic contributions of both first and second generation humanitarian entrants. Professor Hugo is one of Australia's foremost demographers, and I'm delighted to formally release his report today. I'm also releasing an accompanying booklet which summarises the findings of Professor Hugo's research and gives examples of humanitarian entrants who've made a significant contribution to our nation. At first, of course, they must overcome the challenges of building a new life within a culture they may know little about. There are many obstacles they must overcome, including often, of course, learning a new language and a new way of doing things. Often they've come from situations of extended and severe trauma and total dislocation. The challenges are great, but they don't face them alone. We do, of course, provide a range of settlement services to assist humanitarian entrants after their arrival, and we're always seeking new and better ways to help people settle as quickly as possible. Of course, as the recent experience in Newcastle has shown, we don't always get it right. But where we find shortcomings, we need to act quickly to remedy them. In his report, Professor Hugo finds that despite their traumatic experiences prior to coming to Australia, refugees and humanitarian entrants do make significant and unique contributions to the Australian community. For a start, refugees provide a demographic dividend to Australia, as they have the youngest age profile of all migrant groups and have the largest proportion of dependent-age children who will be educated in Australia. They are also the least likely of all migrant groups to permanently leave Australia. Secondly, there is evidence of increased settlement in non-metropolitan areas, creating social and economic benefits for rural and regional communities. So far this program year, around 20% of humanitarian entrants have settled in regional areas. This is up from 10.9% in 2004-05 and 17.5% in 2009-10. By way of example, around 250 refugees have settled in Rockhampton this year and are working at the local abattoir, while another 120 people have found jobs in horticulture around the Coonawarra region of South Australia. Thirdly, Professor Hugo examined in detail the labour market contribution of humanitarian entrants. He acknowledges, as does the government, that employment and participation by humanitarian entrants is low in the short term. Given the cultural, language and economic barriers humanitarian entrants face, as well as the traumatic experience of fleeing persecution, this is hardly surprising. There's no point sugarcoating it. Institutional barriers to workforce participation, such as lack of contacts, local experience or recognised qualifications, invariably make getting a job all the more difficult. But while humanitarian entrants have the lowest incomes of migrant groups and are more likely to work in manual occupations, they play an important role in meeting a definite demand in the Australian labour market. Further, Professor Hugo's research found that humanitarian entrants' experiences in the labour market converge over time towards those experienced by the Australian-born population. Sacrifice is one of the themes noted in Professor Hugo's report. New humanitarian migrants work hard in low-skilled jobs so as to provide their children with a chance to succeed in Australia, valuing their children's education highly. Again, this is something I've seen at close quarters over many, many years in the western suburbs of Sydney. This has resulted in a higher proportion of first and second generation 15 to 24-year-old humanitarian entrants attending educational institutions than the Australian average. At the same time, and personally I found this very interesting, humanitarian entrants also show a greater propensity towards entrepreneurial enterprises, setting up their own businesses to a greater extent than other migrant groups. Of course, one well-known example of that is that 3 of the top 5 positions in last year's BRW Rich 200 list were occupied by children who either came to Australia as refugees or are the children of refugees. But it's not just economically that humanitarian entrants make an important contribution to Australia's social and civic life. Professor Hugo's research found that humanitarian entrants volunteer extensively, both in their local communities and more broadly, a contribution that largely goes unnoticed and unquantified in official statistics. Professor Hugo's research shows us that a resilient spirit and a desire to succeed are common characteristics of humanitarian entrants. So I commend this important piece of research to you today. I truly hope that Professor Hugo's work will go a long way to dispelling some myths and misconceptions and contribute to a more informed conversation about Australia's humanitarian entrants. Now, I don't want to be taken the wrong way. I don't pretend for one second that it's always rosy for humanitarian entrants in Australia and that we can't further improve our settlement services. And this is something I'm interested in doing. But Professor Hugo's research helps put those challenges and areas of improvement very much in context. So, of course, it's for these reasons that I think Australia can afford to resettle more refugees. And that's what I see as one of the significant benefits of the bilateral arrangement entered into by Australia and Malaysia. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to take this opportunity to talk about that agreement and our progress in progressing initiatives under the Regional Cooperation Framework. Now, I want to talk a little about the Regional Cooperation Framework because I don't believe it's received anywhere near the appropriate amount of attention in the Australian political discourse. The Regional Cooperation Framework was endorsed by the 4th Bali Process Ministerial Conference in March. It was a significant achievement. The Bali process brings together 43 member countries, from Jordan to New Zealand. It includes source, transit and destination countries, as well as key international organisations, such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organisation for Migration. And the Bali meeting's decision to implement a regional framework was a very significant step forward. The framework, ministers agreed, will be implemented through practical arrangements and will contribute to a sustainable regional approach. This was an important milestone towards enhancing protection in the Asia-Pacific region, and a huge step forward in terms of regional cooperation of a problem that, despite what some people might argue, does not begin and end in Australia. In our region, several countries host asylum seekers and refugees, in some cases in excess of 100,000. Although these countries, like Thailand and Malaysia, may not be party to the Refugee Convention, it's important we work with these nations to assist in their very considerable caseload of asylum seekers, and that we work with those nations and the UNHCR to develop protection outcomes. Some people take the view that asylum seekers are only Australia's problem when they set foot in Australia. But if we're truly engaging in a regional solution, that means considering what we can further do to resettle more asylum seekers from our region. It means broadening the conversation from those just to arrive at Christmas Island to how we can remove the incentive for irregular movement across our region. Imagine for a moment that someone suggested an arrangement that meant that 1, Australia could resettle more refugees, 2, we could engage with partners like the UNHCR on more consistent outcomes for asylum seekers across the region, and 3, we could provide a significant disincentive for people to make the dangerous journey by boat. Intuitively, you would think that such an agreement would achieve significant support. And that's exactly what this arrangement achieves. It's important that we ensure that people who travel to Australia by boat are treated in line with our international obligations and they be treated with dignity and respect. But this debate should not just be about those who have the money and inclination to make it to Australia by boat. There are 2 groups of forgotten people in this debate. Firstly, there are those who wait for resettlement, who don't have the money to pay a people smuggler. One good thing about the media coverage of recent weeks is that I think it has increased the sensitisation of the Australian people to the difficult situation of asylum seekers throughout our region and throughout the world, and perhaps helped me in arguing the case that we can and should increase our humanitarian intake. The second group of forgotten people in this debate are those who have lost their lives on the journey to Australia. The consequence of people having a greater chance of resettlement when they make the dangerous journey by boat is the kind of tragedy we saw last December at Christmas Island, where a boat smashed against the rocks and up to 50 men, women and children lost their lives. Of course, some will never be found. This isn't the first such tragedy, of course. Civ X sank on its way from Indonesia to Australia in stormy seas in October 2001. An estimated 353 people drowned. Inevitably, there have been other deaths that we are simply unaware of. Similar tragedies have taken place all around the world, of course. Around 200 people died attempting to travel from Libya to Lampedusa in April this year, followed by up to another 250 more deaths following the same route earlier this month. In total, more than 1,000 people have died on boats between Libya and Italy in 2011 alone. And yet there are people who continue to profit from other people's desperation. According to some estimates, the business of people smuggling and human trafficking is now the 3rd largest criminal activity globally after the trafficking of drugs and weapons, worth somewhere between $7 and $12 billion a year. Now, of course, while our plan to break the people smugglers' business model involves transferring people who arrive by boat to Malaysia, we recognise that it's very important that we put the appropriate care and protection in place for those who are transferred. And those protections are being built into the operational arrangements that underpin the agreement. People transferred from Australia to Malaysia will be transferred by agreement between the governments. So it stands to reason, in line with the commitment entered into by the Prime Ministers, that they will not be prosecuted for illegal immigration, will not be caned, will not be refouled. There will be a role for non-government organisations who wish to be involved in making this agreement work through an advisory body with representatives of both the Australian and Malaysian governments and those non-government organisations. Of course, it's particularly important that we put specific care and protections in place for vulnerable cases, most particularly children. Blanket exemptions from transfer would provide a marketing tool for people smugglers and not be in the best interest of any child. What is important is that we work with the UNHCR to make sure that no decision is taken to transfer a minor until that person's personal circumstances are taken into account and that all the necessary care and protection is in place, both in Australia and or Malaysia. And that's exactly what we're doing. In relation to children, this function also provides me with an opportunity to update you on a project that is personally very important to me, the transfer of children from detention centres and facilities into the community. I'm very pleased to be able to tell you that we will meet our commitment to move the majority of children from immigration detention into community-based accommodation by the end of June. Since the Prime Minister and I announced the expansion of community detention late last year, significant numbers of children and family have been progressively moved from immigration detention facilities into community-based accommodation. As of this Wednesday, I have approved 1,309 people for community detention since the government's announcement in October. Of these, 678 are children. Nearly 1,000 people have already been moved out of detention facilities and into residential arrangements, of whom 249 have since gone on to receive permanent visas. We currently have over 700 people living in community detention, including 334 children. A further 352 people, including 195 children, will be moved into the community in coming days. This will bring the total number of people living in the community under these arrangements to 1,059. To date, these people have primarily been placed in suburbs and communities in our major capital cities. A comprehensive care plan is prepared for each person placed into the community detention program. This plan defines appropriate services and support arrangements for each individual or family. Sourcing appropriate housing and ensuring suitable care and services exist, particularly for unaccompanied minors, is an essential element of moving people out of detention. This takes a great deal of organisation. I know some people have said release all children immediately, but it does take a great deal of organisation and a methodical approach to making sure we have the care that's appropriate. There's a need to recognise the amount of work that goes into moving children out of detention and providing them with the support they require, particularly in relation to those who've had traumatic experiences to get here. The rapid expansion of the program to date has benefited from successful partnerships between government and non-government agencies. The Australian Red Cross is the lead agency for the implementation of these expanded community detention arrangements. The Red Cross has drawn and continues to draw on the expertise of a wide range of experienced service providers in the community, faith-based and welfare sectors to source accommodation, care, caseworkers and other services. A residents' determination reference group also meets regularly to discuss issues with the expanded community detention arrangements. This includes representatives of faith-based, not-for-profit and welfare agencies, the Australian Red Cross, Life Without Barriers, members of my Ministerial Council on Immigration Services and Status Resolution, senior departmental officers and a representative of FAXIA. I would like to take this opportunity to publicly thank each of those involved. As I say, it's been a very significant task. It's been an ambitious task to find the accommodation, to find carers for unaccompanied minors, and to move so many children and families into community-based detention. My department has meanwhile established an efficient process to identify eligible individuals or groups with a view to moving them into community-based accommodation. This will, of course, continue beyond the 30th of June as we place more unaccompanied minors and families into the community. Thanks again for the invitation to be here. This year marks several important anniversaries, not least of which the 60th anniversary of the Refugees Convention. Australia has had a long-standing involvement with the UNHCR and was a founding member of the UNHCR Executive Committee in 1958 and also of its predecessor, the Advisory Committee, in 1951. In 2010, Australia provided the UNHCR with over $50 million in funding. We have many shared interests with the UNHCR wanting to strengthen protection, and we're working closely on resettlement needs, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the development of a stronger protection environment in the Asia-Pacific region. This year's anniversary provides the international community with an important opportunity to reaffirm and strengthen the founding principles and values of the international protection regime. We support the UNHCR's themes and commemorations, and my department is currently developing specific pledges that are action-oriented and linked to the goals of the commemorations. We're also actively involved in preparations for the ministerial conference to be held in December this year, which I hope to attend. In this, the 60th anniversary of the Refugees Convention, Professor Hugo's report provides a clear demonstration of the significant contribution that refugees have made to this country in that time. With additional 1,000 refugees arriving in Australia annually from July, we look forward to welcoming the next generation of refugee success stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for staying when I know you had the option to leave and for sharing your thoughts with us. The Minister has indicated that he will take some questions. We only have a short time, so I'll open the floor without any more ado. First hand up was you, Carolyn. Would you like?
It's not on? Yes, it is on. Thank you. I'm Caroline Flay. I'm from Curtin University in Perth. And I'd like to thank you for coming today, and I'd also like to thank you for taking questions. Coming from Perth, we don't often get the opportunity to ask questions of our ministers. You talked about forgotten people, and I think through this whole debate about Malaysia, and I'm sure there are other people who have questions specifically about that, but I'd like to talk about some other forgotten people. And that's the people who are still in detention throughout Australia, many of them in remote locations. And I very much welcome, and many of us do, very much welcome your government's planning to get women and children and families out of detention. But you need to get the men out as well. There are many people here. There are a number of people here who have been in detention and can tell you of the trauma and misery that it exacerbates. And there are many men, women and children who are now well over a year in detention waiting for results of their final claims. There's also many of us here who visit detention centres, and we're bearing witness to the misery that the regime is creating. We recognise that you're not the first government to introduce this policy. We've had it for nearly 20 years, but we very much hope that you are the last government to have mandatory detention. And I think one of the benefits of being here for the last few days is to learn about the alternatives to detention. And the UNHCR has released a report recently on this that I'm sure you're aware of. There are alternatives that, of course, are much cheaper for the Australian taxpayer. There are alternatives that still will allow us to maintain the security of Australia. And there are, of course, alternatives that are much more humane than locking people up on an indefinite basis. So my question to you is, when is your government going to move beyond this preoccupation with pragmatic politics and maintaining the mandatory detention policy? When you're going to move beyond that, acknowledge the suffering and misery that it generates and that it continues to generate after people leave detention, and bring an end to mandatory detention?
Thanks for the question. I've taken a couple of approaches to the issue of detention, and the first and fundamental one is to move people through detention as quickly as we can. Now, that's not easy. It's easier said than done. We've done a couple of things. We've introduced the new protection obligation determination. It's early days, but the evidence I've seen is that it is having some effect in moving people through more quickly. Frankly, the thing that's worried me most is the length of time it takes for security clearances. That is something which I've spent a lot of time in dealing with, and it's frankly been a significant issue for us. I've got to say, I'm very pleased with the progress that we've made. For example, since the 15th of March, 2,667 people have received their security assessment, and of those, 2,059 have already received their security clearance. That's since March. And of those, 1,263 people have been granted visas, settled in the community. I mean, if you'd said 6 months ago that you could achieve those sorts of numbers by more efficiencies in the security clearance process, I think many people would have said that couldn't be achieved. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Is there more to do? Yes, there is. But what we have done is come up, well, I think, working cooperatively with ASIO, a much more efficient system, which means that we do meet our obligations under the Migration Act and our national security obligations, but we do so in a much fairer manner, because it has concerned me greatly that we have people who are 1A Met, sorry for the jargon, and you all know the jargon better than I do anyway, but who are regarded as refugees but are still awaiting their security clearance. That has concerned me greatly. So our focus has been, as I say, moving families and children into the community, and then moving people through as quickly as we can through mandatory detention. I have tried where possible, to bring a different approach. For example, the new detention facility in South Australia, which was very controversial when I announced it, and you might recall I addressed a room not unlike this one, which was very angry about that, but it was the right thing to do because it was closer to a capital city, had more facilities, better able to provide access and support, for example. So that's been the approach I've taken. I understand many of you would say go further and go faster and do more. I understand that, but that's the approach that I take.
Thank you. Gosh, so many hands. I saw the lady with the white hair, and then I saw Pasu before, so we'll go there.
The lady in the lovely scarf, I would describe you as, rather than...
And another woman from Perth, from Carad. You did say we can afford to take more refugees. One really simple way would be to de-link the programs that the Howard government linked in its term. There's no reason not to still accept, in our view, 13,700 humanitarian people, and then make our obligations about people who seek asylum here and settle them in the community. Why can't this be done?
Again, I agree that we can and should accept more refugees. I think 1,000 a year is a very... I'll get to that point. I think 1,000 a year is a good start, and I think as we prosecute the case, and I think the release of the report today, for example, is an important step in prosecuting the case that over time Australia can take more refugees. I think that the political debate around, and I don't mean political in party political terms, but the societal debate around these issues is very vexed. It gets caught up in whole issues of population and sustainability and congestion, which it shouldn't, but that's the political reality. And I think over time, if we can move the debate on and we can deal with the issue of irregular arrivals and reduce the number of those and the political import of that, then we can have a broader debate about the humanitarian program, and we can have the discussion about expanding it further. Of course, that's something I'd be very keen to do over a period of time. I think my approach, again, is not to delink them, but rather to provide better solutions so that the incentive to arrive irregularly is reduced, and therefore you can resettle more people directly from camps, and you can have a discussion about increasing humanitarian settlement over a long period of time, which I would be very keen to do. I see 1,000 extra as a good start. I think over time, if we change the political dynamics and change the political debate that goes around this, then there's potential for that to be expanded further.
Thank you, Aline. Honourable Minister, I have a different question from the burning topic. I have very quick 2 questions. My name is Parsu. I'm a former Bhutanese refugee. I live in Melbourne.
Sorry, where were you from? Sorry,
Bhutan. I'm a former refugee from Bhutan. I work for AMES. My 2 questions are out of that. One is not related to this discussion, but discussing with the different people last 4 days, I found out that once the people are settled in Australia, 510 hours are not sufficient. Minister, please note this. I'm requesting, because my own father has finished he's 70, and he has finished my mother's hour, and he still went to class and he was knocked out. Now you cannot come. There's so many people, because I work with so many refugee communities from AIMS, so this is not enough. Somebody who has not gone to school, please, your government, will you be able to change the policy to increase people who want to learn, because they will contribute to the social well-being of this country. Number 1. Number 2, Minister, this is a bit rosy question, but after 2 or 3 days in the conference sitting here, it looks like Australia will be a better place if we can please introduce in Parliament to increase the humanitarian intake to 20,000. I'm rosy here, but Australia will not be a poor country. We will win the hearts of millions. And if you spell this out in the Parliament, Minister, we'll always bless you. Thank you.
I'll take the blessing. I take what I can get in this job. In relation to your first question, as I said in my opening remarks, I think that we do a good job in resettlement. I think we do a good job in training and English language. Do I think we can do better? Yes, I do. Now, is there an easy answer to that? Obviously, your easy answer will be increase the hours, and I'll be very brutal and frank with you. That costs money, and I would need to argue that with my colleagues and explain why that's necessary as opposed to all the other things that money could be spent on. Do I think that there's a case for having a look at what we do in terms of English language training and seeing if we can do it better and seeing if there's more programs we can enter into? Yes, I do. Because again, not just as Immigration Minister, but as a local member, as somebody who lives in Western Sydney, in one of the most multicultural areas in the country, who grew up there, who went to school with the children of humanitarian and other migrants, I understand the importance of English language training and resettlement, and I do think it's something that we do well. But I am interested in looking at how we can do better. In relation to your request for 20,000, I think my answer to the previous question is probably of a similar vein. I think 1,000 is a good start, a very good start, and I think if we can change that political dynamic and discourse, then we can have a conversation about the humanitarian intake over the coming period.
Thank you. Look, there's so many hands. I'll look at, I saw the lady in the pink scarf, and then we'll go to that side, the lady right at the back. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Honourable Chris Bowen, thank you in advance for clearly answering my questions. My name is Katrina. I'm a Malaysian, and I also work with refugees, migrants and trafficked persons in Malaysia. There are two parts to my question. Firstly, recognising that refugees and asylum seeker women and girls in Malaysia face the terror of being abused, harassed, extorted, tortured and sexually violated every minute of their lives by employers, landlords, the police, immigration officers, RELA members and members of the community, what clear steps and strategies will the Australian government take to work with refugee communities and local NGOs to effectively and honestly prevent this horror and protect the rights, dignity and lives of the 40,000 and more refugee women in Malaysia? Secondly, understanding that the Malaysian government is complicit in enabling and perpetrating these serious human rights violations, what more, beyond mere assurances by these complicit parties, are in place to seriously prevent these abuses? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and my clear answer will be in a couple of parts. Firstly, you ask about what protections are in place, and the protections, when we announce the full details, will be significant. And of course, the number of the people transferred from Australia to Malaysia will be transferred by agreement with the Malaysian government, and therefore the regime which applies to others who, under Malaysian law, have entered illegally would not apply in the same way to these people. Secondly, of course, as I said in my opening remarks, again, we've been working very closely with the UNHCR about the processes that should be in place for assessing vulnerable people as to whether they should be transferred, and if they are transferred, what protections would be in place, and that would apply to the group of people that you would refer to. Thirdly, and this is an important point, which again I think is sometimes lost, you talk about the 40,000 female asylum seekers, the 92,000 registered asylum seekers, and we all know it's much more than that in Malaysia. And children, as I understand it, 18,000 of those are children. I want to see them substantially represented in the 4,000 extra people that we take from Malaysia. That's one of the great benefits of this type of bilateral arrangement. We not only work with the Malaysian government, and I must say the Malaysian government has worked with us in a very good spirit of cooperation, and the UNHCR and IOM, with a view to improving protection outcomes for asylum seekers. That is something they are taking seriously. We also want to work with them with increased resettlement. And if the situation for asylum seekers in Malaysia is difficult, which I accept it is, I think it's a very good thing that we resettle more people from Malaysia into Australia.
There's a lady at the back with the mic, and then I think, in case I'm accused of only allowing women to have the mic, there's a gentleman here. Maybe there'd be the last two questions because I'm being asked to finish. So the gentleman who's had his hand up for a long time in the white shirt. So the two last questions. Thank you.
Minister, I want to thank you in advance for listening to the recommendations of the people who've come here today to talk to you.
I certainly am listening.
I come from Townsville, Minister, and it's one of the fastest regional growing areas in Australia. And we appreciate the policy about sending people out into the regions. My problem is that I'm presented with clients who have enormous range of skills, and yet they are blocked by racism, economic racism, from getting into the very places in Australia which other sectors of the economy are singing out for people to work in. I have a young case of an engineer, came from Iraq, spent 2 years in high school in Townsville, went off to university, gained an engineering degree, electrical engineering degree. We could not find anyone in that community for 2 years to give him the last 12 weeks of placement for his degree. He ended up in hospital from a mental health issue, and his story is just one of thousands. We want you to think about the economic resource as per the report that you announced today. You don't have to go for skilled migration. The skills are already here. So, Minister, what are you going to do about that?
Again, thank you for the question, and I think it's a real issue. And I did talk in my opening remarks about some of those institutional barriers. I think there are things we can and should do. When I announced our recommitment to multiculturalism earlier this year, I announced an anti-racism strategy, for example, a new multicultural council to try and progress some of those matters. Is it easy? No, it's not. Will it achieve its results overnight? No, it's not. No, it won't. Is it a problem which everybody faces? No, it's not, but it's a problem that enough people face for it to be an issue, as you correctly identify. So, look, I don't have the magic answers to every problem that you've identified there. I do acknowledge the problem. I hear it myself. I've seen it myself. I think there are great success stories, as I talked about, but there are also people who suffer from those institutional barriers, and we do need to work together in terms of fixing that. And if there are practical solutions that you want to suggest to me, I'm all ears about real, practical, day-to-day things that we can do to try and break down exactly the sort of situation that you're talking about, because it does concern me. Who was next? Oh,
Hi, Minister. My name is Abdul. I came as a refugee from Afghanistan in 2001 by boat, and I passed.
What year was it? 2001. 9. Yep.
And I took a very risky journey to come by boat and spend time in the detention center. In the last few days, we discussed about the harmful effect of detention on young people and particularly people who spend time in detention. But my question is about the Malaysian deal. And I do understand that people who come here to Australia or seek asylum in other countries is not easy. So they have to take enormous risk to do that. So they are desperate to seek asylum and get protection of Australia. But my question has two parts. First, that as we celebrate the 60th years of refugee conventions, does this exporting people to Malaysia does not violate refugee conventions in terms of non-refoulement? And second is that, as I understand from my time in Australia in the past 9 years, that I found that Australia is a compassionate country, and Australia tried to ban the export of cattle to Indonesia. So does the human being does not work as a cattle to stop banning exporting asylum seeker to Malaysia, as the lady indicated that they will be mistreated in Malaysia? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, the arrangement does comply with the Convention on Refugees. Malaysia has given a commitment about non-refoulement. And can I just say that's a substantial step forward for Malaysia to give that commitment. Is Malaysia a signatory to the Refugee Convention? No, they're not. But they've given that commitment, and that is the first time they've given that commitment. And I think that's seen in many places, and by me, as a substantial step forward and something which should be welcomed. And as I said, if we said that we would not work with countries like Malaysia and Thailand because they're not signatories to the Refugee Convention, I think we'd be missing a great opportunity to work with those countries to improve outcomes, to improve understanding of issues, and to deal with issues like non-refoulement. On the second question, I think it's very important, as I said. I've got to tell you, my hardest day as Immigration Minister was the 15th of December last year, when I received the report about children drowning off Christmas Island. I never want to go through that again. I don't want any other person to go through that again, and I don't want our nation to go through that again. So does that mean some difficult decisions? Yes, it does. But if you can do that in such a way, that means that you work with countries in our region to improve protection outcomes, and you take more refugees and you improve the outcome as you go, that's something that I think we should be doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for giving your time. I'm informed you have to go now. You mentioned just now that you'd be interested in recommendations. All of the work done over the last 4 days will be put into a very comprehensive report with recommendations, and we hope you'll receive that very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In the morning sessions, there was some discussion from various parts of the sessions about what the conference should do about making a statement about this issue. And it's a difficult question because while everybody from all conversations have got very strong views, we are not one group. There are some people who work for government, some people who work with government, some people who work with organisations. So deciding how to do that is difficult. But I think everybody is keen that something should be done. So seeing as it's so difficult, I'm just going to hand the mic to Graham Tom from Amnesty International, because my good friend Graham, as always, has had some ideas. Thank you.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. A tough act to follow. And I think where this in part is coming from is I was moderating the session around regional protection frameworks and the fact that we want to pull together 3 recommendations to take to Geneva literally in the next few days around what we think is the way forward around regional protection frameworks. That's what today is about. However, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, I think. And it would really be a missed opportunity if we did. I'm reminded, I guess, of a situation. One of the first times I went to a refugee camp was on the border of Bangladesh and Burma in Cox's Bazar to deal with the Rohingya refugees. And I was there with Eileen and Linda, and part of what we were trying to do there, not just human rights training, not just to help UNHCR develop a heightened risk identification tool, but to give those refugees a voice and to be able to talk to UNHCR and some of the implementing partners. And we wanted to get their voice out as far as we could. And so they came to me and they said, you know, can you bring the Australian government here? Can you bring the UK government here? Can you bring the US government here? We want to talk to them. And I had to look at them and said, no, I can't. I can't bring those governments to Cox's Bazar for you to talk to. But what I am going to do, being a white, middle-class, privileged male from a developed country, is able to go to Geneva. We were going to take the findings of our consultations with those people to Geneva, to the annual consultations, to the annual tripartite consultations, and we were going to be able, we made a commitment to them to take their voice. That's one thing we can do, is take their voice to those forums in a way that those communities could not. And we sat at the resettlement consultation where we knew no countries were resettling Rohingya out of those camps. We were able to present what we had heard from those individuals. And I think one of the most rewarding moments for me in my career was going back to those consultations a year later and have 6 governments put their hand up and say, we're going to take 100 people out of the camp. We're going to take 100 people. And to have 6 governments come back just 1 year later to give a commitment to resettle people, I thought was fantastic. That doesn't mean it always works like that. It doesn't mean that governments are always going to listen to it. It doesn't mean that UNHCR is always going to listen to civil society. But we do have an opportunity to go, and we do have an opportunity to take a recommendation directly to people who are making decisions around the lives of people who, you know, we are hoping to protect and who are working hard to protect themselves each day in a way that we can't even imagine, or certainly I can't imagine. So in saying that, I know not everybody will want to sign on to a statement. I think we need to come up with a way that perhaps those organisations who do feel very strongly, specifically about an agreement with Malaysia, can sign on to a strongly worded agreement. We're happy to have a chat over lunch about the wording of that. Again, we want to keep this very separate from the ways forward on a regional protection framework, but for those organisations that do feel strongly around this, please come and see me, Eileen and Linda, and let's get a statement that I think, again, captures some of the concerns that we have, but also, I think, needs to capture why there is a principled, what are the principles we're talking about here in terms of the convention, about our commitments, and about the implications of this agreement. So again, I know you all want to get to lunch. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak, and I know Pamela, you want to speak, but maybe I think we can take this downstairs for those who do want to talk about this further, and I'll now hand it back. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you, Greg.
To the organiser.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a busy lunchtime now. The Minister launched the report by Professor Graham Hugo, which is, I think, some of the best news we've had for a long time about refugees in Australia, because it's a report that says what we've all known but has never been documented, that so many refugees do so well and contribute so much to Australia. Graham, would you like to stand up? For those of you who don't know Graham, he's here, and I think